Nobody asked you to become this person. You just looked around one day and realized you already were. You're somewhere between 8 and 10 years old. The details don't matter. The year, the house, the reason things felt the way they did. What matters is this. You learned very early that the adults around you had a weight they couldn't always carry. You learned. Not from a conversation, not from being told. You learned the way the body learns things. Through repetition. Through consequence. Through 1,000 small moments that didn't feel significant at the time, that if you stepped in, things stayed stable. If you noticed before anyone asked, if you adjusted before anything broke, if you made yourself useful before the need became urgent, the house stayed livable. Nobody called it a job. Nobody sat you down and assigned it. But something in you understood the assignment before you had words for it. And you were good at it. That part matters. Not just that you did it, that you were genuinely, remarkably good at it. You could read a room at 9 the way most adults can't at 40. You knew which silences were safe and which ones needed filling. You knew the difference between someone who wanted to be asked and someone who needed not to be pushed. You knew without being taught how to make yourself lighter when the space around you was already heavy. They called you mature. They called you responsible. They called you the easy one. And somewhere in you, something accepted those words as a description of who you were. Not of what you had learned to do in order to survive a specific environment that no longer exists. That's the part nobody tells you. The adaptation becomes the identity. The strategy becomes the self. And by the time you're old enough to question it, you've been living inside it so long it doesn't feel like a choice anymore. It just feels like you. In architecture, there's something called a load-bearing wall. It's not the most visible part of a house. It's not the part anyone decorates or notices. It's the part everything else rests on. It didn't choose its position. It was placed there when the house was being built. And from that point on, it only knows one thing: hold. You became the load-bearing wall of a structure you were too young to agree to support, and the house learned to depend on you before you were old enough to understand what that actually meant. That depending on a child is not the same as the child being strong. It just means the house found something to lean on. 10,000 years ago, this wiring kept groups intact. A child attuned to danger, to the shift in a parent's breathing, to the temperature of a silence before it broke. That child contributed to survival. That hyper-awareness was not a flaw, it was function. The problem is that function doesn't come with an off switch. It doesn't receive a signal saying the environment has changed. The people around you now are not the ones who needed managing then. You can put it down, but you don't. You walk into a room now, a meeting, a dinner, a conversation with someone you love, and your chest is already doing the calculation before your coat is off. Who's holding something they haven't said yet? Where the friction might come from? What this room is going to need from you before the evening is over? Not because anything is wrong. Because your system doesn't know how to walk into a space without immediately finding its position in it. There's a specific moment where this lives. Smaller than the ones people would recognize as significant. Someone asks you what you want. Not in a dramatic context, something ordinary. Where do you want to eat? What do you feel like doing this weekend? What do you actually need right now? And something in you goes quiet, not thoughtful, just quiet. It's not that you don't have preferences. It's that the question lands like it was asked in a language you understand intellectually, but have never quite learned to speak. The question of what you need feels harder than anything else. Your shoulders don't fully drop, even when you're alone. That's not a metaphor. Even in your own apartment on a Tuesday evening with the door locked and no one waiting on anything from you, there is a residual tension across the top of your back that doesn't fully release. Like your body's still at its post, still waiting to be needed. Still, somewhere underneath the quiet, ready. And when there's genuinely nothing to manage, no one to take care of, no situation to hold together, no weight to distribute, it doesn't feel like rest. It feels like missing a step in the dark. A faint wrongness. A restlessness that doesn't match the calm around it. Like your nervous system built itself around having a function, and in the absence of one, it doesn't know what it's for. That specific feeling, that slight unease in the middle of a quiet evening, when everything is fine and nothing needs you, that's what this is actually about. Not the capability, not the reliability, not being the person everyone leans on. The discomfort that arrives when none of those things are required of you, and what that discomfort is quietly asking. There's something that happens in relationships that almost never gets said out loud. You can be deeply loved and still feel like the terms of your presence are somehow conditional on your usefulness. Not because the people around you now are placing those conditions on you, but because your system never received the update that love without a function is still love, that you are allowed to be in a room without contributing to its stability, that your presence, without purpose, without managing anything, or reading anything, or making anything easier for anyone, is still something, that you, without the load, are still someone. Here is where it gets harder to sit with. Some part of you already knows that putting the weight down is possible. You've thought about it. Maybe you've even started to. But there's a question that lives just underneath that thought. One you haven't looked at directly. If you put it down, if you stopped being the person who holds things together, who notices before anyone asks, who makes the hard things easier for everyone in the room, who are you? Not philosophically, practically. What is left when the function is removed? Because if the answer comes quickly and feels solid, then maybe the weight was always a choice. But if there's a pause before the answer, if something in your chest tightens slightly around the question, if the silence that follows it feels less like thinking and more like not quite knowing, that's not a character flaw. That's what it looks like when a person builds an identity around a role they were handed before they were old enough to choose it, and has been carrying it for so long that the carrying feels like the self. You don't have to answer that tonight. Maybe the beginning of something is just this. The next time your system moves before you've decided to, the next time your shoulders tighten in a room that's actually safe, the next time someone asks what you want and the question feels harder than it should, you notice it. Not to fix it, not to push through it, not to understand it fully before you're allowed to feel it. Just to be in it for a moment, without managing it. The house you grew up in needed a load-bearing wall. The life you're living now doesn't. And you're allowed to find out what you look like when you're not holding anything up. If any of this landed somewhere you haven't had words for, leave one word in the comments. Just one. For the person reading this at 2 a.m., who has been the strong one for so long, they've forgotten that being strong was never supposed to be the whole story. You've been carrying this since before you should have had to. That's enough for tonight.